Millionaire invites his maid to his ex-fiancée's wedding. What she did left everyone speechless. Before we begin the story, leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. It had rained the night before, leaving the city washed clean, like a blank page awaiting a new story. Inside the Carter estate, the air felt unusually still. The usual hum of staff movement, the click of designer shoes on marble, and the distant echo of a housekeeper humming a tune. Today, it was quieter, as if even the walls were waiting for something. Declan Carter stood by the window of his study, holding an envelope in his hand like it might catch fire. It wasn't the contents that made him linger. It was what they symbolized. The cream-colored cardstock, embossed with gold leaf and finished with a seal of delicate roses, bore the name that still stirred something in him even after all this time. Stella Kingsley, his ex-fiancée. The woman he once thought he would build a life with. The one who had left him when he refused to leave his company behind after his father's passing. She wanted freedom, art, Europe. He wanted legacy, control, and a place in the world that didn't require asking permission. And now, she was getting married, not to a venture capitalist or a European heir. No, to a small-town architect who wore flannel and smiled like nothing had ever broken him. Declan's jaw clenched as he set the invitation down. He told himself it didn't matter. He was successful, more than successful. He had wealth, property across continents, private jets, and a name that opened doors. But in moments like this, when the mansion was too quiet and the lights cast long shadows on the floor, he felt the truth settle over him like a cold fog. He was alone, and that he couldn't allow the world, her, to see. A knock at the door interrupted his spiraling thoughts. "Mr. Carter?" Rosa, his housekeeper, stood at the edge of the room. She was holding a stack of documents, her uniform crisp, her presence quiet but never small. He turned to her. Something about her composure, the way she never flinched in his presence, always intrigued him. She didn't pander like most around him did. There was dignity in her restraint, a grounded calm in the way she moved through the world. "Come in," he said, his voice sharp, but not unkind. She crossed the room with careful steps, placing the papers on his desk. "Is there anything else you need before I go?" He paused, then spoke before he could second-guess himself. "Actually, yes." She looked at him curious. "Of course." "I need you to come with me to a wedding," he said flatly. Rosa blinked. "A wedding?" "Yes, this weekend. You'll be dressed appropriately. Everything will be taken care of. I'll compensate you for your time." The silence that followed was long enough to feel like a shift in gravity. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter. Did you mean as your guest?" "No," he replied quickly. "As my date." Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Confusion, surprise, maybe disappointment. "Sir, I'm your employee. I clean your kitchen floors and organize your documents. Why would I be your date?" "Because you're not like them," he said. "You're not polished, not fake. You don't smile to climb social ladders. You don't care about headlines." "That's not exactly a compliment," she said softly, her voice steady. "It wasn't meant to be," he replied. "It's just the truth. Stella will be there. She'll have that smug smile on her face, and I won't give her the satisfaction of thinking I was broken by her absence." "You want me to play a role," Rosa said, "to be part of your story." He nodded. "You'll be paid well. It's just one evening. She turned away slightly, eyes drifting to the window. The idea was ludicrous, absurd, offensive even. And yet, the last notice on her brother Marco's school tuition still sat unpaid. Her mother's medical bills kept coming, and she'd long stopped dreaming of things like weekend trips or new shoes that didn't come from discount bins. Still, it wasn't the money that made her say yes. It was the look in his eyes, the one she wasn't supposed to notice. Behind all the bravado and wealth, Declan Carter was a man trying not to drown in his own silence. And somewhere, Rosa recognized that silence. She had lived in it too. "I'll go," she said finally. "But don't expect me to pretend to be something I'm not." His mouth twitched, almost a smile. "I wouldn't ask you to." The next morning, Rosa was picked up in a black town car and taken downtown. When she stepped out, she was greeted by a stylist whose heels were taller than Rosa had ever dared to wear. The boutique was sleek, mirrored, and terrifyingly expensive. "You must be Rosa," the stylist said, already evaluating her. "We're going to make magic." As she was ushered through dress racks and makeup counters, Rosa felt like she was being repackaged. But even with layers of foundation and curls in her hair, she still saw herself in the mirror. Quiet, skeptical, observant. Hours later, Declan arrived to see the final look. She wore a navy blue gown, minimalist, elegant, and entirely unlike anything she'd ever worn. When she stepped out of the fitting room, he said nothing for a long time. Then, "You'll do." She smirked, crossing her arms. "That's the nicest thing you've said to me all year." "I'm saving nicer things for the wedding," he replied. But she saw it. The way his gaze lingered a second too long. The way his voice softened at the edges when he spoke to her. Rosa didn't know what would happen at that wedding. But for the first time in a long time, she felt the stirrings of something unfamiliar. Not fear, not doubt, curiosity. And perhaps a little bit of power. The morning of the wedding arrived with a quiet kind of pressure. It was the sort of day where time seemed to move differently, slower in moments of preparation, and then suddenly too fast as each hour slipped through careful hands. Rosa stood in front of the full-length mirror in the guest wing of Declan Carter's estate, already dressed. The navy blue gown she had worn the day before at the fitting now hugged her figure perfectly. Her hair was swept up into a low twist, soft tendrils framing her face. She looked unlike herself, and yet, somehow, more like the person she'd forgotten she could be. There was a stillness in the room, interrupted only by the ticking of an antique wall clock and the quiet rustle of fabric as she adjusted the thin straps of her dress. She had barely slept the night before, her thoughts too tangled with questions and implications. Why had she said yes? What was she walking into? And more urgently, what would it cost her to be seen beside Declan Carter, in front of the people who once defined his world? The knock on the door came softly, followed by the unmistakable baritone of Declan's voice. "Are you ready?" Rosa took one final glance in the mirror, squared her shoulders, and walked to open the door. Declan stood there, impeccably dressed in a black tuxedo. Under the warm hallway lights, he looked effortlessly poised. His dark hair slightly tousled, jaw clean-shaven, and a sleek watch peeking from under his cuff. He was a man born to command a room, and for a moment, Rosa wondered how someone like him could feel so bruised beneath all that polish. When he looked at her, something flickered in his expression. It wasn't overt, Just a soft pause, a breath drawn differently. "You look unexpected," he said. "Is that your version of a compliment?" she replied, but there was no real sharpness in her tone. He offered a small smile, brief but real. "It is." The car ride to the venue was quiet at first. Rosa sat with her hands clasped in her lap, staring out the window at the city that blurred past them. Declan sat beside her, his fingers drumming against his knee. A quiet rhythm of nerves or anticipation. Maybe both. Eventually, she broke the silence. "Why did you ask me to do this?" she asked, her voice even. He didn't answer right away. When he did, it was with a measured honesty that caught her off guard. "Because when I look at you, I see someone who doesn't need me to be anything I'm not. And today, I need that." Rosa turned her head slowly toward him, studying his profile. "That sounds like a compliment wrapped in self-preservation." "It probably is," he admitted, without shame. The car pulled into the grand estate where the wedding was taking place. An opulent mansion surrounded by gardens, fountains, and guests who looked like they'd stepped out of luxury magazines. Rosa felt the weight of their presence the moment she stepped out of the vehicle, her heels clicking against the marble driveway. Eyes turned. Whispers followed. Declan offered his arm. She hesitated, then took it. Inside, the reception space shimmered with gold and ivory. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen constellations. Servers floated by with champagne flutes and hors d'oeuvres on silver trays. And there, across the room, standing like the centerpiece of her own carefully curated world, Stella. She was radiant. Her gown was pure elegance, her hair a soft cascade of curls, and her smile a weapon polished to perfection. She turned, caught sight of them, and paused mid-laugh. Rosa felt Declan stiffen beside her. The moment was coming, and she could sense it. The collision of old wounds and carefully composed facades. A man approached them first, gray-haired, well-dressed, and familiar with Declan. "Declan Carter," he greeted, extending his hand. "Didn't expect to see you here." "You know I don't shy away from discomfort, Mr. Langley," Declan replied smoothly, "especially not for a celebration this grand." "And your guest?" Langley's eyes moved to Rosa. Before Declan could respond, Rosa extended her hand with quiet confidence. "Rosa," she said, "it's a pleasure to meet you." Langley raised an impressed eyebrow and nodded. "The pleasure's mine." They moved through the room like that, stopping, smiling, answering questions from strangers who wanted to know who she was, where she came from. Rosa played the part well, not because she was acting, but because she knew how to hold her own. She'd been doing it her entire life, in kitchens, in hospitals, in small apartments with big dreams and too many bills. But nothing prepared her for when Stella finally approached. "Declan," she said, her voice sweet but sharp, "you made it." "I said I would," he replied. "You look content." "And you?" She turned her gaze to Rosa, her tone light but laced with curiosity. "Must be the reason for that." Rosa extended her hand again. "Rosa, I work with Declan." Stella took the hand, her eyes never leaving Rosa's face. "How charming." Rosa smiled politely. "It's been a lovely evening." There was something in Stella's gaze then, something searching, measuring, as if trying to decode a language she didn't expect Rosa to speak. "I'd love to chat later," Stella said, stepping back. "Woman to woman." "Of course," Rosa replied, without blinking. As the bride walked away, Declan exhaled beside her. "She's trying to get in your head. She's not the first," Rosa replied softly. Later, as they took their seats and the speeches began, Rosa watched Declan more than she watched the bride. He was quiet, contemplative, eyes fixed on some distant thought. She realized, in that moment, that he hadn't come here just to show strength. He'd come looking for something, maybe closure, maybe redemption, or maybe just proof that the past no longer held him. And what she didn't know, what she couldn't have expected, was that she was no longer just part of his plan. She had become part of the reason he was learning to feel again. And somewhere deep in her chest, Rosa felt it too. Something was shifting, and neither of them could stop it now. The sun had dipped low into the horizon, casting an amber glow across the sprawling estate as the wedding festivities moved into full swing. Laughter echoed from the open ballroom, where music danced between clinking glasses and the hum of conversation. Rosa stood near the edge of the veranda, her hands loosely wrapped around a glass of sparkling water, her eyes watching the sky more than the crowd. Inside, the music shifted to something slow and familiar, a classic waltz that spoke of old romance and bittersweet memories. She sensed Declan approaching before she heard his voice. "You're hiding," he said gently, stopping beside her. "Observing," she replied. "It's different." He glanced at her, then followed her gaze toward the garden. "You handled Stella well, better than I expected." "I've met people like her before," Rosa murmured. "People who live in glass towers and expect others to break under the weight of their gaze." "She likes control," Declan said. "She doesn't do well with mystery." "And what am I to her? A mystery or a mistake?" "You," he said, turning fully to face her, "are a disruption. And for someone like Stella, that's the greatest threat of all." There was silence between them for a moment, filled only by the distant music and the cooling breeze that played with a strand of Rosa's hair. Declan studied her, and for the first time that evening, something softened in his posture. Not weakness, but a quiet recognition. "You don't belong here, do you?" he asked. "I mean, not in this world. Not with these people." Rosa let out a faint laugh. "No, and I don't pretend to. But you do. You move through this room like you were carved from its marble walls." "I used to think that meant I belonged," he said thoughtfully. "Now, I'm not so sure." The truth in his voice surprised her. For all his arrogance and precision, there was a sadness in him, a kind of displacement she hadn't noticed before. He wasn't simply performing tonight. He was searching for something to feel real again. They stood quietly for a few minutes longer, until one of the event coordinators stepped outside, letting them know the dance floor was about to open for couples. Rosa shook her head instinctively. "Don't even ask. I can't dance in these shoes." Declan smiled, almost amused. "You don't have to be perfect. Just follow me." He extended his hand. For a moment, she hesitated, every instinct warning her that stepping back into the spotlight beside him would only further entangle her in something she hadn't agreed to. But there was something compelling about the look in his eyes, something vulnerable. And despite herself, Rosa took his hand. Inside, the lights dimmed, and the orchestra played a sweeping waltz as guests gathered to watch the first dances. Declan led her onto the floor, their steps cautious at first. But he was steady, and Rosa found herself moving with unexpected ease. "You've done this before," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. years of polite society, and a mother who believed dancing well was just as important as running a company. Rosa smiled faintly. Mine taught me how to balance 3 plates and still open a door with my foot. He laughed, a real sound, unfiltered. I'd trade lessons. The conversation faded as they found their rhythm. Declan's hand rested lightly on her waist, and his eyes never left hers. Around them, the world blurred into chandeliers and perfume and curious stares. But in that moment, Rosa no longer felt like an outsider. She felt present. As the song came to an end, applause filled the room. They stepped away from the center as the floor flooded with more couples, but Declan kept her close. "You were incredible," he said softly. "I didn't fall. That's the only bar I was trying to meet." "No," he said, his voice dipping lower. "You turned every head in this room, including hers." He meant Stella. Rosa pulled her gaze away, uneasy. "That was never the point." "I know," he said, "but it happened." Before she could respond, Stella reappeared, gliding toward them with the grace of someone who had never been denied a thing in her life. "May I borrow your date, Declan?" she asked sweetly. He looked at Rosa, and for the first time that night, Rosa realized he was uncertain. "Up to her." "I'm fine," Rosa said quickly. "Go." He gave her a lingering look before following Stella toward the other side of the room. Rosa watched them for a moment, then slipped away from the crowd, back toward the quieter corners of the estate. She didn't belong here. Not really. And watching Declan disappear into Stella's orbit reminded her just how precarious her place was in his world. She found herself in the hallway near the study, her back resting against the wall, eyes closed as she tried to calm the tension rising in her chest. "What are you doing to him?" The voice startled her. She turned to see a tall man in his 50s standing in the shadows, gray at the temples, sharp eyes, the unmistakable presence of someone used to control. Declan's father. "Excuse me?" she asked, unsure whether to be polite or defensive. "You've changed him," the man said. "He's no longer thinking clearly. This stunt tonight, bringing you, it's reckless." Rosa stiffened. "I didn't ask to be here." "No," he said. "But you stayed." There was accusation in his tone, as though her mere presence was a trespass. Rosa straightened, her voice calm but firm. "With respect, Mr. Carter, your son makes his own decisions. I'm not responsible for his pride or his pain." The older man studied her, as if trying to decide whether she was a threat worth addressing or a momentary distraction. "I suggest you remember where you come from," he said finally. "I always do," Rosa replied, and walked away without waiting for another word. Later that evening, Declan found her near the garden again. His tuxedo was slightly rumpled, his expression more tired than it had been earlier. "You disappeared," he said. "So did you." He exhaled slowly. "Stella cornered me, said I looked desperate." "Were you?" "I don't know anymore," he admitted. "Maybe I was, but not in the way she thinks." Rosa searched his face, unsure of what she wanted to find. "I spoke to your father," she said. "He doesn't like me much." "He doesn't like anyone he can't control," Declan muttered. "He's wrong about you." Rosa looked away. "Are you sure?" He stepped closer. "I brought you here to make a point, but tonight I started realizing the point wasn't about her at all." She didn't answer. He didn't push, but something had shifted, not just between them, but within them. The plan had begun as a performance, But now, it felt like the start of something they hadn't scripted and couldn't quite define. The days after the wedding passed with the strange quiet that often follows chaos. Rosa returned to her modest apartment on the edge of the city, where the walls were thin and the evenings were filled with the hum of traffic and neighbors arguing through drywall. But it was her space, her corner of the world, and it had always been enough, until now. There was something different in the air, something unsettled inside her since the night at the wedding. She should have felt relieved, even triumphant. She had survived Stella's jabs, Declan's unpredictable moods, and the suffocating elegance of a world that wasn't hers. And yet, as she washed the makeup from her face that night, all she could see in the mirror was a woman at the edge of something she couldn't name. She had seen something in Declan's eyes, not the arrogance he wore like armor, but something raw, and she didn't know if she was strong enough to look into that vulnerability without losing herself. At the estate, Declan was facing storms of his own. His father's words from the night of the wedding echoed in his head, tightening around his thoughts like a noose. Reckless, foolish, emotional, all the things Thomas Carter believed his son should never be. All the things Declan had tried so hard not to be, until Rosa. Since the wedding, he'd been avoiding the corporate floor, letting meetings run without him, claiming a need for solitude. But the truth was simpler. He didn't know what to do with the space Rosa had carved out in his life. It wasn't just that she had looked beautiful in that black dress. It was the way she had spoken to Stella, unflinching. The way she had danced without belonging. The way she had walked away from his father without apology. Declan wasn't used to being challenged. He wasn't used to being seen. Not really. And Rosa had done both, without even trying. He sat alone in his study, fingers tracing the edge of his Scotch glass, unopened files scattered across the desk. The fireplace crackled, casting warm light on the framed photographs that lined the mantel. Most were cold, boardroom victories, obligatory family portraits, but one stood out now. A candid photo someone had taken during the wedding. Declan and Rosa on the dance floor. She was laughing, just barely, her hand resting lightly in his. He didn't even remember the photographer being there. But somehow, that moment had been caught, like a secret neither of them had meant to share. He picked up his phone, stared at her contact, then locked the screen and set it down again. 2 days later, Rosa was surprised to find a sleek car parked in front of her building. The driver stepped out, tipping his cap, and handed her a small envelope with nothing but a handwritten note inside. "Come to the estate. Just for coffee. D." She sat in silence for a long time. She wanted to crumple the note and throw it away, but she didn't. Instead, she got dressed, not in anything dramatic, just herself. A soft knit sweater, her favorite worn jeans, no makeup, but enough resolve in her eyes to quiet the doubt. When she arrived, Declan was waiting for her by the glass conservatory. He stood when he saw her, hands shoved in his pockets, looking for once like a man uncertain of his next step. "I didn't think you'd come," he said. "I almost didn't." They sat across from each other at the small round table overlooking the garden. It was early spring, and the blossoms outside were just beginning to stir. A tray with coffee and fresh pastries sat untouched between them. Declan leaned forward slightly. "You changed something for me." Rosa crossed her arms gently, watching him. "And now you want to change it back." No, I want to understand it. She let out a slow breath. You brought me to that wedding to prove something to your ex. I was never meant to be anything but a performance. Do you understand how that felt? I do now, he said quietly. But it stopped being a performance for me that night, and I don't know how to go back to pretending. Rosa looked away, her voice softer. You don't get to rewrite it just because it started meaning more to you. I live in the real world, Declan. I can't afford to fall for something built on pride and impulse. There was a pause, heavy and full. I didn't bring you here today to fix it, Declan said. I brought you here because I don't want to keep making the same mistakes I've always made, and because I miss talking to you. That last part caught her off guard. Rosa folded her hands in her lap. Talking is easy. Changing is hard. I'm trying, he said. But I'm not asking you to believe that today. Just don't shut the door yet. They sat together in silence after that. No dramatic declarations. No forced intimacy. Just two people trying to find a place where truth could live without shame. When Rosa finally stood to leave, Declan walked her to the door. He didn't touch her. He didn't ask for anything more. But as she stepped outside, he said her name, and she turned. Would you come again? Not for me. Not for show. Just as you. Rosa hesitated, then nodded once. Maybe. He smiled, and it was different this time. Less polished, more human. Maybe's enough. She walked away without looking back, but something in her chest felt lighter. She still didn't know what would come next. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid to find out. Rosa hadn't meant to see Declan again so soon. After the quiet coffee in the conservatory, she had returned to her routine. Early mornings at the florist where she worked part-time. Evenings designing handmade pieces for her slowly growing online store. It was the kind of life that required her attention, her energy, her whole being. And yet, a piece of her attention, however stubbornly she tried to deny it, kept circling back to him. She had expected their encounter at the estate to end things, or at the very least, give her the closure she thought she needed. Instead, it had opened something unfamiliar inside her, a door to possibility. Not romance, not yet, but something quieter, the beginning of understanding. 3 days later, she found herself standing in front of Carter and Monroe's downtown office building. She hadn't been summoned this time. She was there by choice, holding a simple envelope in her hands, a proposal for a floral installation she had designed herself, inspired by the mansion's glass conservatory. When she walked into the lobby, the receptionist smiled. Mr. Carter asked me to let you through whenever you arrive. That caught Rosa off guard. She hadn't even told him she was coming. Declan was in his office, but this time he wasn't behind the desk. He was standing near the window, looking out at the city. The skyline shimmered under the late morning sun. He turned when he heard her footsteps. You came. I have something for you, she said, holding out the envelope. It's for the reception area downstairs. Something natural. Something that doesn't look like it came from a catalog. Declan took the envelope, but didn't open it immediately. Why? Because I wanted to offer something real, Rosa replied. And because I wanted to do something on my terms this time. He nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling between them. She waited as he opened the envelope and scanned the sketches inside. Gentle arches of ivy, native flowers arranged in layered textures, a soft interplay of earth tones and color. This is beautiful, he said. "You have a gift." "I have perspective," Rosa answered, "and I've spent a long time pretending it didn't matter." There was something in the way she said it that made Declan realize just how far apart their worlds had been, not just in wealth, but in how they'd learned to protect themselves. His armor had been money and image. Hers had been silence and resilience. "I want to support this," he said. "We'll commission the full installation." "I don't want favors, Declan." "This isn't a favor. It's recognition." She studied his face, looking for signs of performance, ego, manipulation. But all she saw was sincerity. That afternoon, Rosa stayed to discuss the logistics with the operations team. She handled herself with calm professionalism, guiding the conversation with the quiet authority of someone who had built herself from the ground up. Declan mostly listened, stepping back, letting her lead. Later, as she packed her materials, he walked her to the elevator. "You belong here, you know," he said softly. "In this building, in rooms where people listen when you speak." She didn't respond right away. Her instinct was still to push back. But instead, she just nodded. "Maybe one day I'll believe that too." The elevator doors opened, and she stepped in. As they closed between them, Declan realized that belief was something she didn't ask from others, only from herself. In the weeks that followed, Rosa's installation took shape in the lobby. Every morning before work, she would stop by to check the lighting, adjust the arrangements, tweak the balance between formality and warmth. She wanted the piece to feel alive, like something that breathed with the rhythm of the building. Declan passed through often, always brief, always watching, and Rosa noticed something changing. He started walking the office floors more, stopped taking meetings behind glass. His staff smiled more, greeted her by name. The company's edges had begun to soften just a little. One morning, as she was securing the final piece of a hanging ivy arc, she lost her balance and slipped from the stepladder. It wasn't a fall, not really, but enough to make her heart skip. Declan, who had just entered the lobby, rushed forward and caught her by the waist before she could steady herself. "Careful," he said, his voice sharp with concern. "I'm fine," Rosa insisted, pulling herself upright. "It's not the first time I've nearly broken something." "Still," he said, steadying her, "let me worry for a change." She looked at him, not expecting the gentleness in his voice. It wasn't about drama or control. It was about presence. And for the first time, she let him have that moment. Later that evening, he sent her a photo of the completed installation under soft light. Attached was a message. "You changed this place more than I ever did. Thank you." Rosa didn't reply right away. She stared at the message, rereading it more than she wanted to admit. And then, instead of texting back, she showed up at the estate the next day, unannounced, carrying a basket of leftover flowers and a bundle of lavender wrapped in newspaper. Declan answered the door himself. "I came to replant something," she said. He stepped aside and let her in. They didn't talk much that afternoon. Rosa worked in the side garden, replacing brittle hedges with color. Declan watched from the veranda, sipping coffee, letting the silence grow comfortable. Occasionally, he offered help, and she showed him how to loosen the soil or secure a root without crushing it. At one point, he paused beside her and said, "You said you wanted to do things on your terms. What do those terms look like now? She wiped her hands on a cloth and looked up at him. They look like this. No performances, no pretending, just showing up. Building something that lasts. Declan nodded. I think I'm ready for that. They didn't kiss. They didn't make promises. But they stood there in the garden, hands dirty, surrounded by the first signs of spring. And for Rosa, that was enough. Because healing, like growth, begins in the soil. Messy, unseen, but full of life. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't waiting for someone else to offer her the light. She was becoming it. In the days that followed their quiet afternoon in the garden, something unspoken began to unfold between Rosa and Declan. There were no grand declarations, no sudden shifts, just a subtle unraveling of the walls they had both spent years building. Rosa returned to her work, but now her mornings felt different. The scent of soil still clung to her hands. Her eyes lingered longer on light filtering through leaves. Something within her had shifted, not toward romance exactly, but toward trust. And trust, for Rosa, was far more sacred. Meanwhile, Declan found himself thinking about the way she moved. Deliberate, self-assured, like someone who'd learned early on that the world wouldn't give her anything for free. He admired that. It haunted him too, because he knew he had never had to fight like she had. And yet, around her, he felt like he was fighting now. For clarity, for purpose, maybe even redemption. One quiet evening, he called her. Not to discuss business, not to make a request, just to ask how her day was. You're calling just to ask about my day? Rosa's voice was wary but not unkind. Is that so strange? It is, a little. You're not exactly known for small talk. Maybe I'm trying something new. She was silent for a beat. Then softly, I finished the lavender sachets tonight. For the local market, my place smells like midsummer and memory. Declan smiled into the receiver. That sounds beautiful. It is, and it's mine. For the first time in a long time, what I'm building feels like it belongs to me. He let her words settle. He understood what she was saying, more than she probably realized. Will you let me see it? He asked. Not the sachets. The world you're building. Rosa hesitated. Then she said, Not yet, but maybe soon. The next morning, Rosa found a small package outside her apartment door. Inside was a pair of gardening gloves. Sturdy, well made, and clearly chosen with care. No note, but the gesture was unmistakably Declan's. She stared at them for a long while, then placed them gently on her workbench, like a seed she wasn't quite ready to plant. A week later, their paths crossed again, this time at the charity gala hosted by Carter and Monroe. Rosa hadn't planned to attend, but an invitation had arrived with her name etched in calligraphy alongside a handwritten message. No roles, no expectations, just come as you are. She had almost tossed it aside, but something stopped her. So she arrived, not in the elaborate dress she might have worn to blend in, but in a simple gown the color of pressed flowers. When she stepped through the grand doors, the crowd turned to look, but not because she was flashy. It was something else. Presence, quiet strength, a woman who carried her own story. Declan saw her from across the room. For a moment, he didn't move. He just watched as she spoke politely to one of the board members, her posture relaxed but self-contained. She was both in the room and beyond it, unshakably herself. He approached her with a calm smile. You came. You invited me, she said, and you said I could come as I am. I meant it. They stood together near the edge of the room, the buzz of conversation humming around them like background music. This isn't really my world, Rosa said, scanning the chandeliers and polished suits. It's not mine either, Declan admitted. Not anymore. That surprised her. She turned to look at him, questioning. I used to think these rooms were where success lived, he explained. But lately, I think success might look more like a pair of hands covered in soil. Rosa smiled, gently, quietly. That's a nice thing to say. It's not just a thing to say. I believe it. Later, as the evening progressed, Rosa was asked to join a conversation with several local business leaders who had taken an interest in her design work. Declan stepped back, letting her shine. She spoke with clarity, not selling herself, not performing, just sharing her ideas, her process, her belief in craftsmanship and sustainability. People listened, not just because she was impressive, but because she was real. Afterward, Declan found her standing on the balcony alone, gazing out at the city. You were brilliant, he said. I was myself, Rosa replied. He stepped beside her. That's what brilliance is. They didn't talk for a while. The city stretched out before them, endless and humming. Then Declan said, I've been thinking a lot about how this all started. You mean the wedding? No, he said, shaking his head. I mean us. Me asking you to play a part in a story that wasn't yours. Rosa turned to face him. You didn't force me. But I used you, he admitted. Maybe not with cruelty. But I used your presence as a weapon against someone else, and I've regretted it more than you know. Rosa's eyes softened. And yet, if none of that had happened, we wouldn't be standing here now. I don't want this to be something built on regret. Then stop looking back. Her voice was steady, her gaze clear. She wasn't offering him forgiveness as a gift. She was offering it as a challenge, to grow, to be more, to live in the truth of now. Declan nodded slowly. You're the only person who's ever spoken to me like this. Then maybe you've been listening to the wrong people. He laughed, genuinely, and Rosa allowed herself to smile too. When the gala ended, they walked out together, not hand in hand, but side by side. The air was cool, fragrant with night jasmine. No promises were made, no futures declared, but the silence between them felt open, like something waiting to be written. In her apartment that night, Rosa opened the windows and sat at her table with a cup of tea. She thought about the journey she'd taken, unexpected, winding, filled with missteps and small, quiet triumphs. She thought about Declan, not the man he had been, but the one he was becoming. She didn't know where this was going. And for the first time in her life, that felt okay. What mattered was that she had reclaimed her voice, her choices, her story. And this time, she was writing it with her own hands. In the days that followed the gala, something had changed. Not in the dramatic way of fairy tales or films, but in the quiet, almost imperceptible shift of two lives beginning to revolve around a shared center. Rosa returned to her workshop, pouring herself into her designs, her hands busy, but her mind no longer clouded by the burdens she once carried alone. And Declan, though surrounded by his empire of glass towers and spreadsheets, found himself looking out the windows of his office more often, searching for something beyond numbers, something he hadn't even known he was missing until recently. He started visiting Rosa's studio in the early evenings, never unannounced, never with any grand agenda. Sometimes he brought her coffee, other times books he thought she'd like, books on architecture, poetry, plants. Once, he brought her a small potted lemon tree. "It's stubborn," he said, "hard to grow. But if you're patient, the fruit is worth the wait." She smiled and placed it near the window, where the sun would reach its leaves each morning. Their conversations were no longer filled with guarded undertones or awkward pauses. They spoke of ordinary things: the changing weather, local markets, the sound of the river at night. And through those simple moments, something more profound began to unfold between them. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't obligation. It was connection. Slow, real, and entirely theirs. One evening, as Rosa was cleaning her brushes, Declan lingered near the door, watching her with an expression that wasn't easy to read. She noticed. "You're quiet tonight," she said, glancing over her shoulder. He nodded. "I've been thinking about the kind of man I've been, and the kind I want to be." Rosa paused, setting down her brush. She didn't speak. She knew he didn't need answers, just space. "I used to believe power meant control," he continued, "commanding the room, making the decisions, being unshakable. But lately, I've realized real power is vulnerability. Real strength is listening, admitting when you've been wrong. And I've been wrong, Rosa, so many times." She looked at him, her expression soft but firm. "I don't want you to be perfect, Declan. I just want you to be honest. With me, and more importantly, with yourself." He stepped closer, but kept a respectful distance. "I am. I'm trying." That night, he left without touching her, without asking for anything. But when the door closed behind him, Rosa stood still in the quiet of her studio, her hand resting on her chest, as if steadying something within her that was stirring awake. Days passed, and Declan surprised her with a proposal. Not romantic, but professional. He had partnered with a local community organization focused on revitalizing neglected urban areas. He wanted Rosa to lead the design of a public garden in one of the city's most forgotten neighborhoods. A space that would belong to the people. A space that breathed. At first, she was hesitant. "Why me?" she asked. "Because you see beauty where others don't," he replied. "And you make people feel like they belong in it." It was the first time anyone had ever described her work that way. Rosa agreed, and together they began sketching plans, selecting materials, visiting the neighborhood to listen to the voices of those who would eventually walk those paths, sit on those benches, plant their hopes in the soil. It became more than a project. It became a mirror, reflecting who they were becoming when they weren't pretending, when they were simply choosing to show up for something that mattered. On a particularly windy afternoon, while discussing native plants and seating areas, Rosa tripped slightly on a loose stone and laughed, a warm, honest laugh that echoed across the empty lot. Declan reached out instinctively, steadying her. For a moment, their hands lingered. She looked up at him. "Thank you." He didn't let go right away. "I don't want to be just someone who passes through your life." Her breath caught. The wind tugged at her hair, but she didn't move. "I don't want to either," she said, barely above a whisper. They didn't kiss. They didn't make promises. But that moment, gentle, fragile, felt like the start of something deeper than declarations. That evening, Rosa received a call from her mother. It had been months since they'd spoken. They talked for over an hour, and when Rosa hung up, she felt both heavy and light. Her mother had apologized for not understanding her path, for judging her choices, and for the first time in years, Rosa felt the door to forgiveness open. Later that night, Declan texted, "Still thinking about the way you laughed today." Rosa smiled, typed a reply, and then deleted it. Instead, she picked up the phone and called him. "Come over," she said. When he arrived, she was barefoot, her hair still damp from a shower. There was no makeup, no pretense, just Rosa, in her most unfiltered form. Declan paused at the threshold, sensing the shift in the air. "I'm scared," she said, without waiting for him to speak. "Not of you, but of what this could mean." He stepped in, closing the door behind him. "Me too, but I'd rather be scared with you than safe without you." That night, they didn't fall into each other's arms like movies often insist. Instead, they sat on the floor, knees touching, talking until sleep pulled their heads together. When morning came, Rosa woke up with her head on his shoulder. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she needed to run. She didn't feel like she had to protect herself from being seen. Because he had seen her. And he stayed. The morning after Rosa and Declan fell asleep on the studio floor, sunlight crept in through the tall windows, casting warm gold across paint-stained wood and paper sketches scattered like fallen leaves. Rosa stirred first. For a long, quiet moment, she watched Declan sleep. His features unguarded, his brow relaxed in a way she rarely saw when he was in his business world. There was a boyishness to him now, a softness that reminded her that even the strongest men sometimes carry wounds they don't know how to name. She didn't wake him. Instead, she gently slipped out of his embrace, walked barefoot to the kitchen, and began making coffee. The scent filled the room slowly, wrapping itself around the silence like a familiar blanket. When Declan finally opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was her silhouette in the morning light, her hair messy, her body moving with a kind of graceful purpose that felt almost sacred. He sat up, stretching, then ran a hand through his hair. Rosa turned to him with a soft smile. "Coffee?" He nodded, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "You always this peaceful in the morning?" She shrugged, pouring him a mug. "Only when the world doesn't feel like it's spinning too fast." "Ja, Tubben." He took the coffee, their fingers brushing for a moment. "Then I hope today spins a little slower." There was something profoundly intimate in the simplicity of it all. No declarations, no expectations, just presence. But beneath that peace, both of them knew that life outside that studio was waiting, and that it wouldn't pause just because they had found a fragile kind of comfort. Later that day, Rosa returned to the garden project site. Children were running through the grass where there had once been broken glass and concrete. Elderly neighbors sat on newly installed benches beneath trees still young but already offering shade. She watched a woman kneel to plant lavender in one of the community beds. Rosa approached her with a smile. "This place means something now," the woman said, her eyes not leaving the soil. "You didn't just bring flowers, you brought breath back." Rosa felt her throat tighten. That was the goal, but inside, she realized it had become more than that. This garden wasn't just a professional achievement. It was proof that something beautiful could grow from broken things. Just like her, just like Declan. Speaking of him, he hadn't called all day. Not a text, not a word. And though she told herself she didn't expect anything, the silence was a seed of doubt. When she finally returned to her studio that evening, her phone lit up with a message from him. It was short. "Can we talk? Tonight." She hesitated, staring at the screen. There it was again, that flicker of fear. What if the night they shared had meant more to her than it did to him? What if vulnerability had made her misread everything? Still, she replied, "Come by." An hour later, Declan arrived, dressed not in his usual suit, but in jeans and a dark sweater. Casual, human. He looked at her with something heavy in his eyes, and Rosa felt her chest tighten. "I didn't mean to go quiet," he said, not bothering with small talk. "But something happened today." She leaned against the counter, arms crossed, bracing herself. "What is it?" "I had a meeting with investors," he began. "Some of them, old family friends, heard about the community garden, about us. They weren't happy." Rosa frowned. "Why would they care?" "Because," he said, pacing now, "they think I've gone soft, that I'm getting distracted, that I'm putting sentiment over strategy." "And what do you think?" she asked, voice low. He stopped. "I think they're wrong, but they control a lot. Their money, their influence, it's tied to the future of my company, to everything I've built." Rosa felt something cold slip into her chest. "So you're here to tell me you're choosing them?" "No," he said quickly. "I'm here to tell you I'm choosing me. And for the first time in my life, that means walking away from people who've shaped me since I was a child." She stared at him, unsure. "Why?" "Because you made me see who I could be, Rosa. Not just the version people respect out of fear, but the man who leads from truth. And I can't go back to pretending that the old way is enough. Not after you." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged. With risk, with hope, with the terrifying thrill of stepping into the unknown. "I don't want to be your awakening," Rosa said quietly. "I don't want to be another project you throw yourself into and then walk away from when it gets inconvenient." "You're not," he said, stepping closer. "You're the first thing that's ever felt real." They stood there, inches apart, the hum of the city faint beyond the studio walls. Declan reached for her hand, not to pull her in, but simply to hold it, steady and warm. "I don't know what this becomes," he whispered, "but I want to find out. With you." She didn't answer right away. Her heart was pounding, loud and unsure. But then she looked at their joined hands, at his eyes, no longer guarded, at her reflection in his gaze, not someone who needed saving, but someone who had helped him save himself. "Okay," she finally said, her voice trembling. "Let's find out." They didn't kiss. Not then. Instead, they just stood there, letting the stillness settle. Two people, once strangers on opposite ends of a vast, invisible chasm, now walking the narrow bridge between fear and trust. Outside, the sky was turning indigo, and the lights of the city blinked on one by one, as if the world itself was making space for something new. The days that followed unfolded like quiet ripples in water, small, subtle changes that somehow shifted everything. Rosa and Declan didn't rush anything. There were no dramatic gestures, no grand proclamations. Instead, they met each other in small, honest moments, in the quiet coffee sipped in the morning sun, in the glances exchanged during meetings, in the silent understanding that healing doesn't require noise. But outside their growing bond, the world remained unforgiving. One morning, as Rosa prepared her studio for a client meeting, her phone buzzed. It was a message from her landlord, curt and unapologetic. Property will be listed for sale next month. You have 30 days. The words hit her like a blow to the stomach. That studio was more than her workspace. It was her sanctuary, the place where she found herself again. Losing it felt like being asked to surrender a piece of her soul. Later that evening, Declan found her in the garden. She was kneeling in the dirt, her hands covered in soil, her cheeks flushed not from labor, but from the quiet battle she was fighting inside. When he called her name, she didn't look up. "Rosa," he said again, walking closer. "You didn't answer my calls." "I saw them," she replied softly, her voice strained. "I just didn't know what to say." He crouched beside her. "What's going on?" She paused, then handed him the message. He read it quickly, his brows furrowing. "I'll buy it," he said without hesitation. "The building. You'll stay." But Rosa shook her head. "No, that's not the answer." "Why not?" he asked, frustrated. "I can fix this. I can help." She looked at him now, her eyes steady but tired. "You can't always fix everything with money, Declan. If I let you buy my studio, what will I owe you next? My vision? My choices?" His face softened. "That's not what I meant." "I know," she said, "but I need to do this my way. If I can't fight for my space, I'll never believe I belong in it." There was silence between them, not of anger, but of respect. He understood her more than she realized, because underneath his instinct to solve things, he knew what it meant to fight for something you built from nothing. The next day, Rosa met with a local nonprofit organization she had once collaborated with. She offered to teach sustainable design workshops for under-resourced communities in exchange for temporary studio space. The proposal surprised them, but they agreed. It wasn't glamorous, but it was enough. She wasn't giving up, just finding a new way forward. Meanwhile, Declan was fighting a battle of his own. His board of directors had grown wary. The changes he'd implemented, the shifts in company values, the reallocation of funds towards social initiatives, had sparked quiet dissent. Investors whispered behind closed doors. They called him reckless, distracted. One afternoon, during a tense board meeting, one of the executives confronted him directly. "This woman," the man said, with thinly veiled disdain. "Rosa. She's become a liability to your reputation. We've all noticed." Declan's jaw clenched. "She's not a liability. She's the reason I stopped being the kind of leader who only looks at profit margins." "Exactly," the man replied coldly. "And that's the problem." Declan stood then, calm but unyielding. "If redefining success is a problem, then I'm proud of it. We're not just here to grow numbers. We're here to build something that matters." The room fell into a heavy silence. Some looked away. Others glared. But Declan didn't waver. That evening, he went to see Rosa. She was sketching plans for a new garden installation, sitting cross-legged on the floor of her temporary space. He didn't say anything at first, just sat beside her. "You were right," he said quietly. "This world doesn't make room for people who care more about meaning than money." She smiled, not looking up from her sketch. "Then we'll carve out our own space." And they did. In the weeks that followed, they built something new. Not just in business, but in the way they lived, led, and loved. Rosa's workshops grew in popularity, attracting designers, educators, and students alike. Declan restructured his company, giving voice to younger, purpose-driven minds. He created a grant program in Rosa's name to support sustainable community projects across the state. One morning, as they walked through the now flourishing garden they had built together, Declan stopped and looked at her. "You're not just the woman I brought to a wedding to prove a point," he said. "You're the woman who reminded me who I could be." Rosa looked at him, her eyes soft. "You didn't need reminding, Declan. You just needed to stop running." They stood there, hand in hand, surrounded by the laughter of children playing, the scent of lavender blooming, and the knowledge that they had both fought, bravely, stubbornly, for this moment. Their love hadn't come from ease. It had come from choice. Again and again, they had chosen to see each other fully, to listen, to stay. And in a world that often prizes control and certainty, they had found their strength in vulnerability and change. As the sun dipped behind the skyline and cast long shadows across the garden path, Rosa leaned her head on Declan's shoulder. "Do you ever think about that wedding?" she asked. He chuckled. "Sometimes. Mostly how wrong I was." "No," she whispered. "You weren't wrong. You just hadn't met the right woman yet." And for once, Declan Carter, the man who had once believed love was nothing more than a strategic weakness, didn't respond with wit or sarcasm. He simply held her tighter, because he knew this wasn't strategy. It wasn't survival. It was the beginning of something real. The city shimmered beneath a golden dusk, casting soft light across the skyline, the kind of light that made everything look like it had been touched by something sacred. From the rooftop garden of the new Carter and Wells Community Center, a space that hadn't existed 6 months ago, Rosa stood with her hands resting on the railing, gazing at the world she had fought to rebuild. Below, laughter from children drifted up through the trees, mingling with the low hum of music and voices from the inaugural celebration happening inside. She had just stepped out for a breath, needing a quiet moment to absorb it all. The last year had been relentless, transformative, painful, and extraordinary. What had begun as an arrangement built on pride and appearance had slowly unraveled into a journey of redemption, trust, and unexpected love. She remembered how it all started: the wedding, the nerves, the dress that didn't quite feel like hers, and the man who had once used her presence as a weapon against his own broken ego. Declan. She closed her eyes briefly, the sound of his laughter echoing in her memory. Fuller now, unburdened. He had changed. Not in the dramatic, overnight way that fairy tales promised, but in the way that mattered most. Steadily, honestly, with intention. Every step forward had been one he chose. He had listened. He had learned. And, most importantly, he had let go of the version of himself that once believed power was more valuable than purpose. Behind her, the glass doors slid open quietly, and Rosa turned to see him. Declan was dressed in a simple charcoal suit, his usual crisp elegance softened by the lack of a tie, and his hair slightly windswept from the rooftop breeze. He smiled as he walked over to her, a tired but proud smile, the kind that carried weight, the kind built through shared battles. "You disappeared," he said gently. "Just needed a minute to breathe," she replied. "It's a lot." "I know." He joined her at the railing. For a moment, they both looked out in silence. The city stretched out before them, but neither felt the need to speak. Eventually, Declan turned toward her. "You know, I used to think milestones were marked by profit margins, project completions, acquisitions. the kind of things you could quantify on paper. He paused, eyes searching hers. But tonight, seeing all of this, hearing people speak about the impact of your work, I finally understood something. This, he gestured to the community garden below, the children running through it, the people gathered inside. This is the first time I've built something that actually feels alive. Rosa's eyes softened. Because it is alive. It breathes because it was built with heart, and not just mine. He reached into his pocket, then hesitated. There's something I've been carrying with me for weeks, he admitted. Something I've rewritten 100 times in my head. Declan, she began, but he gently took her hand, grounding her. I need to say it, he whispered, even if it's not the right time, even if all I get is silence. From his coat, he pulled out a small, weathered notebook, the same one Rosa had once seen tucked between papers on his desk, always just out of reach. He opened it slowly to a page marked by a folded corner and handed it to her. She read the first few lines, her eyes tracing each word as if decoding a secret. To the woman who never asked for anything but gave me everything. You didn't change me. You reminded me I could change myself. If there is a life after this, in any form, I would find you in every one of them. Rosa looked up, tears clouding her vision. Declan. He stepped closer, his voice steady but quiet. I don't want this to be another chapter we look back on with what ifs. I want it to be the beginning of the life we both dared to believe we deserved. He reached into his other pocket this time and pulled out a simple silver ring. No diamonds, no extravagance. Just something honest, human. His voice trembled ever so slightly. I know we've both lived lives that taught us to keep our hearts guarded. But with you, Rosa, I don't want to guard mine anymore. I want to share it, with all its cracks and colors. Will you marry me? The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was reverent. Rosa's tears slipped freely now, not from fear or confusion, but from the beautiful ache of knowing something profound had just been offered. She took the notebook from his hands and closed it gently, pressing it to her heart. Then she looked at him. Not the millionaire, not the man from the tabloids, but Declan, the man who learned to rebuild himself, not in solitude, but in connection. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will. The rooftop lights glowed warmer then, or maybe it just felt that way. From below, someone began calling their names, but for a little while longer, they stayed where they were, wrapped in the golden quiet of two people who had finally come home to each other. Weeks later, they exchanged vows under the branches of the same tree Rosa had once planted in her mother's backyard. It was a small ceremony, intimate and simple, but rich with meaning. Lucas, her younger brother, walked her down the aisle. Lucy, Declan's former housekeeper, wept openly. There were no grand statements, only a promise to continue choosing each other through every season of growth and change. Together, they built not just homes and businesses, but lives that reached beyond their own. Rosa's design initiatives expanded internationally. Declan used his company to champion causes that once terrified his board. And through it all, they stood side by side. Not perfect, not untouchable, but real, present, and deeply committed. What began as a plan born of pride had become a love born of purpose. And that, they both knew, was the most beautiful surprise of all. As the dust settled from the whirlwind of everything that had transpired between Evelyn and Nicholas, between the old life and the new one Rosa had stepped into, a rare kind of stillness took its place. It wasn't the kind of stillness that signaled an end. No, this was something else. More like the deep breath before the beginning of something meaningful, something hard-earned and infinitely precious. Theirs had never been a perfect story, but it was one forged in truth, tension, redemption, and the bravery to face the uncomfortable parts of themselves and each other. Rosa had started her journey in a place most would overlook, a position many would dismiss without thought. She was a maid, invisible in a mansion filled with polished marble floors and hollow echoes of power. But within her lived a quiet fire, one that refused to die even when the world tried to extinguish it. Every glance that diminished her, every condescending word, every shadow she walked through only made her strength take deeper root. It is easy to underestimate someone like Rosa. What's hard is to realize that behind her silence was wisdom, behind her humility was fierce dignity, and behind her simplicity was a heart that carried more substance than those who wore their worth in gold and silk. Nicholas, on the other hand, had been raised by the world to believe he was untouchable. Wealth had cushioned every fall. Pride had masked every insecurity, and charm had excused every mistake. But when Evelyn, the woman he once thought he would marry, left and tried to erase him with a single event, Nicholas chose the only strategy he knew: retaliation wrapped in elegance. He asked Rosa to play a part, never realizing she would become the mirror that would show him who he truly was. What began as a performance, an elaborate distraction from his pain, turned into something deeper, something raw and real. Rosa's unfiltered honesty pierced the armor he wore every day. She wasn't swayed by his title, his estate, or his curated confidence. She saw the loneliness behind his bravado, the regret beneath his dismissiveness, and the aching need to be understood. And for the first time in his life, Nicholas felt seen, not as a billionaire or a symbol of success, but as a man trying, failing, and reaching. And perhaps that was the turning point, not just in their relationship, but in their personal stories. Because redemption is never born in grand gestures or well-rehearsed speeches. It is born in the quiet choices. When Nicholas began showing up, not just for the public image, but for the team behind the scenes. When he learned to apologize without justifying. When he listened, truly listened, and changed the way he treated people around him. Rosa, too, evolved. Not by becoming someone else, but by finally allowing herself to step into the fullness of who she already was. She learned to take up space, to own her voice, and to stop shrinking so others could feel taller. Together, they built something rare, not out of convenience or desire, but out of mutual growth. It was not an easy love. It was a tested, refined, and slowly formed connection. Their relationship became a conversation, one of forgiveness, of mutual respect, of letting go of who they were to become who they needed to be. But the true beauty of their story doesn't lie only in the romantic ending. It lies in the transformation it sparked in others. Evelyn, for all her flaws, had once been someone who desired more from life, and Rosa's quiet resilience reminded her of what she had once stood for. The staff who once whispered behind Rosa's back came to respect her, not just because she was Nicholas's choice, but because she never demanded respect. She earned it. The investors who once doubted Nicholas's judgment found themselves reevaluating the kind of leadership they valued. Slowly, what started as a selfish plan at a wedding became a lesson for everyone who witnessed it. And that is the magic of a real story. One that doesn't require everyone to be a hero from the start, but allows them to stumble, to fall, and still rise into something better. What Rosa and Nicholas proved is that background doesn't define character, and titles do not dictate who's worthy of love or influence. What matters most is who you choose to be when no one's clapping, when you're hurt, when you're tempted to retaliate, when you're faced with a chance to grow or stay bitter. This story is for every person who has ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told they don't belong. It is a tribute to every woman who chose dignity over drama, and every man who learned that real strength lies in vulnerability. It's for those who carry invisible burdens, but show up anyway. For those who rebuild their lives after being broken, not out of revenge, but because they believe they are meant for more. And perhaps, most of all, it's a story for those who are still somewhere in the middle of their journey, still unsure, still healing, still figuring it out. Let this be your reminder. You are allowed to start again. You are allowed to want more. You are allowed to change. And you are allowed to be loved, not despite your imperfections, but because of the courage it takes to live with them. As Rosa stood next to Nicholas at the launch of their new initiative, one that supported women in underserved communities to start their own creative businesses, she felt not like someone who had been lifted into the spotlight, but someone who had finally stepped into her own. And when Nicholas looked at her that night, he didn't see the maid who once dusted his shelves. He saw the woman who helped rebuild his soul. So wherever you are in your own story, whether you're at the beginning, in the messy middle, or clinging to hope near the end, know that your story matters. It may not be perfect, it may not be glamorous, but if it is honest, if it is brave, and if it is yours, then it is already beautiful. Thank you for joining us in this journey. If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of something you needed to hear, we invite you to support this channel by subscribing. Every click, every share, and every comment helps us keep telling stories that honor the complexity of real people, real love, and real transformation. Subscribe today so you never miss the next chapter. Because your story, and stories like Rosa and Nicholas's, deserve to be told, and we can't wait to share the next one with you.